our last session on Bonhoeffer for Troubled Times with Jeffrey Pugh. And we're going to get started as always. And feel free to interrupt in the chat with any questions you might have, especially since this is our final time together. Taylor, you are going to pray us in. So take it away, sir.
Indeed. Jeffrey, thank you for making this time for us each week. We really appreciate it. Love you. Hope we get to hear some different voices from you tonight. It's going to be great. Looking forward to it. This is a poem written by Bonhoeffer while he was in prison. For you Methodists out there, this poem actually shows up in the United Methodist Hymnal. It's number 517, I think, in the Methodist Hymnal. This is by Gracious Powers. So I'm going to treat this poem, hymn, as a prayer. If you will, please pray with me. By gracious power, so wonderfully sheltered and confidently waiting come what may, we know that God is with us night and morning and never fails to greet us each new day. Yet is this heart by its old foe tormented? Still evil days bring burdens hard to bear. O give our frightened souls the sure salvation, for which, O Lord, you taught us to prepare. And when this cup you give is filled to brimming, with bitter sorrow hard to understand, we take it thankfully and without trembling, out of so good and so beloved a hand. Yet when again in the same world you give us, the joy we had, the brightness of your Son, we shall remember all the days we lived through, and our whole life shall then be yours alone. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
So take it away, sir.
So we have talked for the last 3 weeks about Bonhoeffer and his context. Bonhoeffer with Hitler and Hitler's theology was our first session. Bonhoeffer and the legacy of anti-Semitism in Germany and how Bonhoeffer himself is even caught up somewhat in this in the second. And then last week, a bit more about Bonhoeffer and the struggles of the confessing church and the failure of the confessing church in the Nazi onslaught. And that failure meaning that Bonhoeffer moved into the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler by joining with German military intelligence. So I thought I'd like to close tonight, and I know 4 weeks is not enough to do justice to such a complicated and interesting figure as Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But I thought I would like to close tonight with something a little bit more contemporary and some things that I learned being part of the August the 12th clergy resistance in Charlottesville in 2017. So if you don't mind, I'm probably just going to go ahead and read the paper that I prepared with backed up. Occasionally I'll stop and talk about the pictures that you're seeing. Sweat dripped down my back as I gazed at my reflection in the mirrored sunglasses of the Pennsylvania Lightfoot militia member standing in front of me. His AR-15 slung casually over his shoulder. He fixed his gaze on me, impassive, and I hoped that the finger that was resting on the top of his trigger guard indicated training that had prepared him to stay calm when the chaos hit. Turning my attention from him, I looked up and down the line of clergy and other counter-protesters who had marched into Market Street to take space in Emancipation Park in Charlottesville, Virginia, the morning of August the 12th, 2017. I considered our raggedy little group chanting and singing "This Little Light of Mine" as the humid August air permeated our robes and stoles, shirts and bodies. And in the face of strutting, smirking racist, it seemed like a small thing. But it was what we had. Waging peace is always a vulnerable exercise. As far as churches go, this one was unique. Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, all sisters and brothers in that moment as we waited for the inevitable explosion of hatred. And in the midst of all of this, my thoughts turned to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I started reflecting on his life, his time, his choices. Would the growing crowds of fascists seeking violence have been familiar to him? Would he recognize our meager line of resistance as the church? And as the morning progressed and the atmosphere of violence thickened, I thought a lot more about Bonhoeffer, and more pictures will follow. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and racists swaggered past our line, carrying the flags and shields and clubs and pictures of Hitler, symbols of their allegiances, videotaping us for later doxing, certain that we posed no real threat to them. And once positioned inside the temporary metal police barricades of Emancipation Park, they took to taunting us, chanting, blood and soil. Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us. They echoed a world that I had only known in books and videos, a world I never expected to experience on the streets of America. Now, our training had prepared us to remain silent, to take whatever happened and let it go. But somewhere deep inside of me, I wanted to fling back the insults that they found so easy to launch in our direction. And on the streets that morning, I recalled what I had learned about Germany, what it was like in the early 30s, the masses out on the streets, the violence of the brown shirts, the pitched battles for social and political space. If we were in a similar historical moment, the beginnings of the type of social upheavals that led to social catastrophe, I couldn't escape the feeling that the church was going to fail this time as miserably as it did in Bonhoeffer's day. He would have recognized the missed moment when the church could have flooded the public space to say that racial hatred corrupts and destroys, that God incarnate means that all human beings should be regarded with the dignity that God incarnate allows. And our meager band seemed inconsequential to the crowds gathering around us. It seemed like a small thing. We all know it is dangerous. And I've said this before in the last 3 weeks, when we too quickly connect our time to past moments, because we will misread both the time that we're living in and the past that we're looking at. And that said, we also fail when we cannot see the family resemblances in history in recurring political moments when they appear on our streets. So America today is very much different than Germany in 1933. I think we're seeing that right now. Though the creeping authoritarianism of our political life, while blunted, it's not over, and it will return. So thinking about Bonhoeffer when I was on that line, I thought a lot about community. What type of communities, what type of communal spaces has the church created that can adequately respond to the world as we now experience it? What visions of life being created in those communities, and what are the public manifestations of those visions that actually hold some kind of public sway in America? And I was challenged by Bonhoeffer's timeless questions that morning. Are we still of any use? He wrote that in the article that I actually had sent out to the rest of the group 10 years after. And where is the church when so much is at stake? And I fear it remains as enfeebled as it was in Bonhoeffer's time, unable to discern the moment, too weak, too captured by the idolatries of nationalism and security to respond to the assaults of those who desire to dominate and control our public life. Now, the thing about August the 12th is, if it were not for an upstart clergy who were dissatisfied with the church's response to Charlottesville, there would have been no clergy presence that day. Okay. Sorry. There would have been no clergy presence that day. The clergy collective here in Charlottesville, not Congregate Seville, had recommended that we just back off, that people in Charlottesville let the Nazis have their day, and that we not show up, that we make no clergy presence. But Seth Wispaway, United Church of Christ clergy here, and Brittany Kane Conley were co-founders of the newly formed Congregate Charlottesville, realizing that Charlottesville needed a more robust form of resistance, set up training, nonviolent training, for those who were committed to a nonviolent response. There was a call on social media for people of faith to come to Charlottesville for August the 12th, though the numbers of those who showed up was a bit disappointing. And so for 5 weeks, we trained in the summer, led by a Black activist, Asa Yefo Sekou, who came to Charlottesville to help us prepare for what he had experienced in Ferguson. 30 some years of studying about Bonhoeffer and the German church struggle had taught me one thing. When the Nazis come to town, you have to show up. Absence is not an option. You can't cede space to fascists. And when the National Socialists took power in Germany, the abject failure of Christianity to escape its own captivity to anti-Semitism and resist the forces building in that country remains a stain not yet erased. When Hitler seized power, Christianity was an ineffective opponent, not the least because over centuries it had defined itself in relationship to the state, its power to the state. And even with the confessing church, those who rallied under this banner never really showed up in mass for the protection of Jews. Occasionally they did for the protection of euthanasia victims and other factors. But standing on that line on August the 12th, I pondered whether the future of the church in America would suffer the same moral failure in the face of authoritarianism. Acquiescence to political authority is baked into many, many religions. There's a reason for this. We won't go into it this evening. Christianity is no exception. Faced with growing extremism and racial hatred in America, most Christians prefer to go about their lives as if nothing was at stake and the state will handle it. There's even a sizable contingent of Christians who will happily support without question any regime that dangles political power in front of them in return for their unquestioning loyalty. Various expressions of Christianity throughout church history have always held a strong attraction for those who worship power and call it God. Most Christian communities desire to preserve their privilege in the midst of uncertain times. Now, you may think this is unfair, and I'll be happy that we can have this argument when I'm done. But the idols of institutional maintenance and the grasping of privilege only weaken a church that cannot stand on the side of the oppressed or the least of these when the icy winds of fascism blow. So what happens in Charlottesville is that the Unite the Right started organizing in the summer of 2017. It was absolutely no doubt who these people were. They were Nazis, they were neo-Nazis, they were racist, and they were coming to have their sort of Nazi Woodstock in Charlottesville for reasons that I won't go into either. The night before, on August the 11th, there was a torchlight rally, a torchlight march on UVA's Rotunda. Across the street, we were meeting in the Episcopal Church and holding a worship service, and they lit out these torches and started their rally while we were still in the church. Now, I had left before these torches were lit to go home, but other people were still there. Many of you probably have read about these events. They did not come to praise Jefferson, but to bury him. The past is never really past. It can always become the present. And there was absolutely no doubt in our minds about what these folks were there for in Charlottesville. Now, the stated reason for this rally was to defend the removal or to protest any removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee from Emancipation Park, which what was called Emancipation Park in Charlottesville at the time. Those who came to defend that came armed. Now, the people that you're looking at in this picture are not Virginia State Police. They are not Virginia governmental forces of any kind. These were armed forces. I think these were the 3%ers, the Pennsylvania Lightfoot militia, who had come to protect the Nazi rally. This had become shocking in its time. It has now become a common occurrence on the streets of America, which is to our shame. They came armed. They were extraordinarily armed, and they came prepared. And they lined the park, and we did not come armed. This is the group of people, most of whom trained over that summer after we had had a large worship service at the Baptist Church on Main Street. We marched into Market Square. The people there on the front row, the fellow with the long red stole is Seth Wispaway. The woman to his right is Brittany King Conley with the dark blue stole, purple stole. I am in the back with the baseball cap on and clergy drag. We did come prepared. We did not come with weapons. We formed a line in front of the park. These guys formed their own line. And once again, these are not official militia. These are not official anything. These are people who came from the outside to protect the Nazi rally. And we look fierce there, don't we? With our weapons and our singing and old people and young people. And yeah, it just wasn't that formidable a force. These guys were lined up about every 10 yards in this picture. And as the day went on, in the face of militias, the police even stood down. The police of Charlottesville stood down. The Virginia State Police stood down. Once again, these guys were the force that was holding sway at that time. Now, our resistance wasn't great. It was a group of clergy, some non-clergy, singing "This Little Light of Mine." And early in the morning, the crowds were sparse. Later, the Nazis started coming in on both sides of our line, and we would continually be having to flip our sticks to make sure that our backs and our fronts were covered at all times. They were recording us so they could put us on social media later and dox us, but you can see from the t-shirt that this man is wearing, who's taking the pictures, where his allegiances and sympathies rest. As the morning went on, the crowd started to thicken. The park grew increasingly packed, and things grew much darker. And this is when the shouts of "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us," blood and soil, started raining down from the park onto us. And this is a full park looking out to where we were. So as this went on for some time, at some point, they started coming into an area where they were not allowed by agreement with the city of Charlottesville to go. So they started coming into some stairs, and we, those of us who were ready for this, decided that we would go occupy the stairs to see if we could block them from coming in, which we could not do. And I just want to say here, and he probably doesn't know he's in this picture, but hidden from you on these steps is the district superintendent, Jeff Mickle, who was in Charlottesville that day and was in on these steps. And once again, he's out of the picture. But when these guys came busting through and started knocking us down, he was part of that. He was part of that group. Now, he'll probably never say that to anybody. I think it's Alexandria District. See Alexandria District Methodist guys?
Yeah, he was profoundly embarrassed when I asked him about him being there.
He shouldn't be embarrassed.
He just didn't want to draw any attention to himself.
I know, but bearing witness is not drawing attention to yourself, and the Methodist presence that he represented speaks well, at least for a church that will show up. Many Christian communities desire to preserve their privileges in the midst of uncertain times. Bonhoeffer challenges us, and later on, the League of the South came down. This was the last group to come into the park that day, and this is when things started clashing, and all the things that you folks may have seen on CNN and other channels, and my daughter saw in France, where she was at the time, when Antifa and the neo-Nazis, League of the South, clashed. We were standing on the stairs. We had been broken through by one group, and as the League of the South came down, they were chanting, from what I hear, "Kill the faggot priest." And they started moving to the stairs. And this is when the groups that we know that are called Antifa started coming up to actually protect those of us who were on the stairs. Fearsome people, Antifa. These are the pink and black folks. And like I said on one of the other podcasts with Jason and Crackers and Juice, if there are no Nazis, Antifa's off drinking beer and playing Pokemon Go. They're not, they're not a fierce group. Now these are different than the black box people, but this is right before the clash at the foot of the stairs. And I have to say, it was one of the most horrific, violent things I've ever experienced being a part of. Now, all of this is by way of leading us to Bonhoeffer. In the section Guilt, Justification, and Renewal in his Ethics, Bonhoeffer still speaks. The church confesses that it has witnessed the arbitrary use of brutal force, the suffering in body and soul of countless innocent people, that it has witnessed oppression, hatred, and murder without raising its voice for the victims and without finding ways of rushing to help them. It has become guilty of the lives of the weakest and most defenseless brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. This confession seems perennial to us. On that August morning, struggling with my own fears, Bonhoeffer challenged me as never before when he says, "I am guilty of cowardly silence when I should have spoken. I am guilty of untruthfulness and hypocrisy in the face of threatening violence. I am guilty of disowning without mercy the poorest of my neighbors. I am guilty of disloyalty and falling away from Christ. And so when the shouts of Jews will not replace us sound out in your city and parades of tiki torch bearing Nazis light up the night sky, as university students, faculty, and staff are attacked, you can't remain silent. If you do not resist the hatred when it appears, it will metastasize, and to be silent is to be complacent." And so I found myself on August the 12th standing with my new church, a flash mob of resistance that had come to our town intending to mark Charlottesville as their territory. In the intensity of that moment, all of the theology, all of the theory that I had absorbed in a lifetime of learning was not enough to adequately respond to the spirit of death and destruction that hung on the air. And as the day wore on and my wife and I transitioned to monitoring the jail to ensure everybody arrested would be accounted for, I saw up close the faces of those who had witnessed Heather Heyer's death, how the spirit of nothingness creates certain facts on the ground that cannot be denied. And at the end of a long and exhausting and horrible day, 3 people would be dead, others injured in my city of ruins, hashtag Bruce Springsteen, dealing with the trauma of assault. Since that day, I've pondered how Bonhoeffer could be a guide, to be our guide into understanding the ways in which Charlottesville was but a symptom of some larger dis-ease in the world. And I'm still struggling. I still wrestle with how to interpret the rising hatred and division I see growing daily around the world. And that said, I have also struggled with how I responded to the fearful and cowering lost souls with their guns and other weapons pouring down curses on our heads. They wanted us dead. They wanted us gone, erased, even as they chanted, "You will not replace us." And I have to say, in the moment, I struggled deeply with the fact that I wanted the same thing for them. I wanted them gone and erased and not a part of my city. And in the face of such implacable hatred, does Christ have a word for us? Does Bonhoeffer give us wisdom? Does a church of white privilege offer any true and authentic witness in the face of this kind of continuing turmoil and hatred? What possible word of reconciliation with Nazis can there be? So since Bonhoeffer's theology took shape in one of the most horrific expressions of racial hatred in the last century, I think he can be our guide when society turns to its worst instincts. See, this is why I studied Bonhoeffer. This is why I was intrigued with him in college and ended up sort of following along deeper and deeper and deeper into Bonhoeffer scholarship, because he kept sort of inspiring me for all of the human flaws that he possesses. He inspires me to think about the fact that, and this is important, all of his theology is grounded in the materiality, in the reality of the world. Living into Bonhoeffer's struggle means to understand reality clearly. And by that, I mean understanding the very devil nature of reality. And Bonhoeffer makes one of those radical claims that theology makes about the world. God's presence continually infuses the world that we experience. And if this is correct, then Bonhoeffer's insight that, quote, wisdom is recognizing the significant within the factual, end quote, means we are not allowed to withdraw from our civic struggles into our own personal piety. We immerse ourselves in the world on the streets and gathering places of our cities and communities, even as the world, Bonhoeffer says, exhausts its rage on the body of Christ. Where we stand in that immersion is of increasing importance. Attention to the present material reality in front of us is crucial to understanding the type of questions Bonhoeffer challenges us with now. What is Christianity for us today? Who is Jesus Christ? What do we really believe, he says? I mean, believe in such a way that our lives depend on it. Every moment we inhabit confronts us with what we are willing to risk our very lives for. So that's part one of this. If you could just hold questions until we work our way through this. Mm-hmm. Part two is going to talk about the current, I think, political situation. If Bonhoeffer were still alive, how might he look at the political situation in which we currently find ourselves? So I want to take out a moment, for just a moment, and lay out the contours of the world that we presently inhabit, how Bonhoeffer anticipated that world, and why this is important for us to understand. And then I'll finish with another look. I'll come back to Charlottesville. In a section entitled Heritage and Decay in Ethics, Bonhoeffer gives his analysis of Western society, of Western civilization. And he points out how the growing secularity of historical movements dating back to antiquity, what would later on he would call the coming of age of the world, changed both the world and Christianity. Bonhoeffer saw promise in this secularity, seeing it as an opportunity to address the world not from its weaknesses, but through its strengths. But the move to the secular was not without its problems, because a rationality loosened from all commitments to faith, a rationality created that has no sense of virtue to anything other than utilitarianism, leads to a will to power. Without being informed by Jesus, our technology and our science become tools that we use to seek dominance over nature. Bonhoeffer points his readers to the uneasy relationship between technology, mass movements, and nationalism that emerged from the rise of the Enlightenment to shape the world that we live in. And he warns that when political powers gain use of these technologies, they will try to control the masses. Just think about this for just a minute. Bonhoeffer is writing this in a moment when he saw this taking place around him. But now we live in the world of big data and social networks. We are presently living with the social and political consequences Bonhoeffer discerned through his understanding of how a world loosened from any moral virtue other than power can manipulate masses. There's a danger in loosening all ties to Christian heritage, which for all of its flaws, its crusades, its wars, its violence, its use by political powers to manipulate, still holds promise for a community that embraces all persons as creations of God. Commitment to incarnation, God with us, Jesus Christ is the significant within the factual, gives us the sight to see the world in a way that resists our enlistment in political ideologies. In the one body of Jesus Christ, humankind exists and is interpreted in such a way that difference can be both acknowledged and unified at the Eucharistic table. Having, instead of this promise, seldom achieved by the church, Bonhoeffer wrote in this section, Heritage and Decay, that nihilism too often occupies this particular vacuum. Having lost its unity that was created by the form of Jesus Christ, the West is confronted by nothingness, nichts. Uncontrolled powers clash with each other, and everything that exists is threatened with annihilation. Bonhoeffer stood in a unique historical moment, but the same political will to power can manifest itself anywhere at any time in any society. The nothingness is not a natural order, but the state where society exists when no vision other than power and control shapes the world. The nothingness is an abyss into which all things fall, where nothing exists except for the present moment. Now, I know this sounds maybe a little too highfalutin, but you see the material aspects of this kind of nihilism in the current political situation. In a compelling description of nothingness, Bonhoeffer writes, it is a creative nothingness that blows its anti-God breath into all that exists, creates the illusion of wakening it to new life, and at the same time sucks out its true essence until it soon disintegrates into an empty husk and it's discarded. Life, history, family, people, language, faith. The list goes on forever because nothingness spares nothing. All fall victim to nothingness. Bonhoeffer astutely recognized that every historical moment is vulnerable to the poverty of meaninglessness. As political and social factions scramble for maintaining their position and privilege, when nothingness overtakes the world, political and economic power are the only things that matter. Time itself becomes unimportant because past and future evaporate as persons chase the immediate moment, fleeing pain and suffering. In this world, even law and the truth are contested space. Bonhoeffer writes, quote, because truth is not trusted, specious propaganda takes over. Because justice is not trusted, whatever is useful is declared to be just. Now think about the times that we're living in, the difficulties that we're having with truth and what propaganda does, and the problem that we're having with justice. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, we can kind of sense that things are a little bit out of balance. It's hard not to hear the echoes of fake news and truth is not truth in Bonhoeffer's writing. Turning our backs on the form of Christ that shaped thousands of years of society and cultures in the West, we've created a world that desires safety and security and thus opened the door to new oppressors. who promise to keep us safe at the cost of our freedom. And often this promise of safety comes in the form of tribalism or cultural identity. This particular form of nothingness all too often maps itself into the world of the pure and the impure. And the agenda for purity that I experienced out on the streets of Charlottesville and that Bonhoeffer experienced on the streets of Germany is a totalitarian agenda driven by the spirit of fear. That animating spirit uses issues like free speech to mask a more troubling reality. The taking of public space by force is not an act related to free speech, but an attempt to dictate to others what reality looks like. And that whole notion about the pure and the impure, and I think I said this before earlier in these presentations, you know, what happens in this kind of situation when nothingness rules, when nihilism rules, is that an act of murder becomes an act of piety in the wrong hands, excuse me. Totalitarians use fear for dominance and control of persons. The fear that drives this desire to dominate is the spirit of nothingness and destruction. And that spirit emerges from the political orders and the realities that we ourselves construct. Not to put too fine a point on this, there are political orders that happily use chaos to seize power, claiming they do it in the name of the people. And you see them globally, and not just in our day, but in the times in which we have grown up. I was born in the 50s, and I've seen this occur many times. In the aftermath of Charlottesville, we must be clear and resolute about confronting the powers that are relentlessly creating human beings who believe that no one has worth other than their tribe or their group or their community. And in that world, offering a person a cup of water to a thirsty person in the desert becomes a criminal act. For those of you who have done mission trips or run mission trips out to the deserts of Arizona, you know what I'm talking about. In the face of powers that desire to divide human beings from one another along class and racial lines, we proclaim all human and non-human, all human life has a moral claim on us. And in the world of nothingness, social arrangements are built on lies and corrupted ideologies. Bonhoeffer's comment, he writes, quote, "The desire for absolute freedom leads people into the deepest servitude," end quote. That's a penetrating look into humankind's weaknesses. The deeper into the absolute person sink, the more destructive their ideology or their theology can become. When nothingness rules, freedom masks the creeping shadow of totalitarianism. And concretely, one of the church's tasks in this moment is to continually confront the world with that truth. A world constructed around lies creates a spirit of destruction where community breaks down, relationships are destroyed, and society gives into the spirit of fear as mobs are mobilized against the enemy. When nothingness prevails, political and economic ideologies create human beings as commodities to serve the gods of efficiency in the market. We are impersonalized. We are alienated from one another. Resentments are stoked, and unscrupulous politicians, and what Bonhoeffer calls in ethics, when he's writing in code about Hitler, he says, despiser of humanity manipulates emotions and thoughts in people so that he can gain control. In the cultural wasteland of negation and nihilism, people lie without remorse because power is more important than community. And we are presently experiencing the painful results of a nothingness where lies have become the currency of the realm, and we are being conditioned not to recognize what the truth looks like. So, for example, the world is now constructed on the belief that everything will be all right if we can just run the markets okay, if the economics are okay. We don't think about the human frailty, the human emotion, the fallenness even That means a fatal delusion can drive the world, that we are easily susceptible to manipulation by those who desire to create the world in their image. And no greater example of the explicit nihilism Bonhoeffer warned of can be given than demanding that people give their lives for the state or the empire, especially when the systems of power use the state solely for their interest. Yep, that's as offensive to us as it was to those people who were listening to Bonhoeffer's day. The masters of nothingness have created a beast that cheats us all from the lives that God desires for human beings. Bonhoeffer's focus on concrete reality, the concrete reality that he lived in, challenges us to accept the true nature of the multiple realities that are continually vying for validation and acceptance of us. And in the midst of these multiple realities calling for our allegiance, Bonhoeffer says there's one true reality. He writes, there are not two realities, but only one reality, and that is God's reality revealed in Christ in the reality of the world. In light of the incarnation, how do we look past, how do we peer past the nothingness to see the reality that truly rests within all things? That within all things, God is present, that God created this world. How are we to relate to those whose identities have been so intensely constructed on the fascist architecture of fear that their ability to understand the world as holy and sacred has been erased? Our identities are being shaped every moment of our lives to prevent us from seeing clearly that if we are not careful, nothingness rests at the heart of our political and economic orders. Political propaganda and the media create our internal worlds in ways that we are just beginning to grasp. If our social lives are shaped by a vision that constantly dwells on enemies and the need to destroy them all, then we must be vigilant about what we're hearing. If you're aware of the network of racist and white supremacists that are being connected through the internet as I speak, the communities that are forming online, you realize we live in some very challenging times, and we have a very, very, very hard road ahead of us. If we heed those who tell us that whiteness or wealth are the only positions from which to order our world, we have suffered dismemberment from those whom God has created. And when nothingness reigns, the world loses its memory of the reality that desires to nurture all life into the fullness of being. So that's the middle section of this presentation, in which I think Bonhoeffer, when you read his analysis of society and ethics, I think he has some very pertinent things for us today to consider and think about the way in which we are ordering our world. So if what he's saying, if what I have just said in some ways accurately describes the concrete reality in which we presently live and move and have our being, then I hate to say this, there will be intense future disruption down the road. Structures that have shaped the world since the Enlightenment and the rise of the modern state are experiencing more challenges, more power grabs as power among the wealthy and the powerful accelerate. And in the American context, an ideology that seeks the imposition of corporate control of the political process and police control of all resistance has been remarkably successful. So in the face of gathering storms that threaten to unleash more hatred and social unrest, if the church seeks political power as it did in 1933 to ensure its survival and status alone, it becomes captive to those other powers and will in the end do their bidding through acquiescence, through complicity, through silence in the face of crimes and even atrocities. You know, I just want to say this is not respecter of political orders that we presently know. The church was silent concerning the deaths by drone bombing in the Obama years. Bonhoeffer understood that the more the church holds to its integrity, the greater threat it is to corruption. It would suffer at the hands of the politicians because allegiance to something more important than the state threatens the powers. And Bonhoeffer writes that the more the church holds to its central message, the more effective it is. Its suffering is infinitely more dangerous to the spirit of destruction than the political power that it still retain. In his struggles with National Socialism and a church that had capitulated to them, Bonhoeffer's focus on Christ's presence in the midst of life means that in some ways God's reality in Christ is made known when the church itself manifests Christ. And this is our center. The one body of Christ cautions us about how we legitimate the orders that rule and discipline other bodies. A true rendering of reality cannot happen without recognition that Christ claims the totality of our lives. Bonhoeffer writes, in Christ, we are invited to participate in the reality of God and the reality of the world at the same time. The implications of this are profound because it strips legitimacy from all those powers and all those orders that don't manifest the life of God within us. The life of God in the world reconfigures this reality away from that which the state and nothingness seek to impose to something more threatening. Their view of reality is not the ultimate view that commands our allegiance. Faithfulness to the gospel may mean betrayal of the culture, even to the point of stopping the state in its tracks when it attacks the vulnerable. And this is when Bonhoeffer was writing The Church and the Jewish Question. He said there are three responses. You can address the state, you can minister to the victims of the state, or you can take the wheel from the state, which was radical in 1933. Bonhoeffer's spiritual and physical exile during the Nazi regime and the collapse of so much of his constructed world focused his theology on the suffering of Christ, the one body that revealed the suffering of so many bodies. And this, above all things, centered his response to the world. It is not the religious act that makes someone Christian, he said, but rather the sharing of God in God's suffering in the worldly life. Telling the truth about what we see unfolding around us means confronting the powers that create suffering in order to maintain their power. And everything that I'm getting ready to say, I'm saying from my own space and not from the space of crackers and juice. Immigrant children being stolen from their parents and forced to live in squalid tent cities while Nazis march on the streets are material realities of racial hatred and animus. Leaders using fabricated injuries, they taking your jobs, they're coming for your wealth, to dehumanize human beings and pit them against one another, serve the spirit of nothingness. No true account of our present life, our present circumstances can be given without an examination of the larger political and social forces behind our current politics. And this is what Bonhoeffer actually gives us the vision or the eyes to see, even connected way further back in the past than we can sort of entertain or think about. As Bonhoeffer pondered the future of Christianity toward the end of his life, especially in a section of the letters and papers from prison that he was writing, an outline for a book, he tries to state the core of what Christian faith demands. And he reminds us, this is a book that he wants to write when he gets out of prison, when he thinks at some point maybe he'll be able to be released. And he's trying to say, when I get released in the absolute collapse of Christian civilization, what are we going to take with us from the ashes of this? And Bonhoeffer challenges us and he says, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And then he says, what are we willing to put our lives on the line for? And for Bonhoeffer, this is not doctrine. This is not theological abstraction. We are most fully an authentic witness when we are present for others, when we are willing to face the things like white supremacy or racism and other systems that harm the vulnerable, that prevent human flourishing. When we're even able to look at the world in terms of systems and understand how they operate and maybe how our participation in them keeps them going. But in this confrontation, we must be alert to the danger of losing our own souls, which brings me back to that morning of August the 12th. What I didn't anticipate happening on the streets of Charlottesville was how deeply I would struggle with who those others are. I had assumed that the others were the Black Lives Matter, the Jewish community, the various counter protesters who came to say no to fascism. I was certain that the others were those targeted by the Nazis, those that shared that clergy line, the Black and brown bodies, the queer folk who stood fast. But was the other also the scared and fearful fascist in my face shouting faggot? If I truly believe that God becomes flesh to suffer and absorb the hatred of the world, then I cannot say that God's grace is closed off from those who seek to destroy me. And this is the radicality of the gospel that so unnerves us. This is something more than the baby Jesus that we will start to think about, but this Advent as we anticipate coming light, as we await in the darkness. My anger at those who came to Charlottesville to assault me put me in peril of losing the reality of the gospel. And this is the true danger of the spirit of nothingness, that our struggle against those forces that harm God's people and planet ends up being solely about political ground. Bonhoeffer understood the dangers here, even he was pulled by the gravity of responsibility himself into political violence. Reflecting on the way that we become captive to evil, he wrote, when evil becomes powerful in the world, it simultaneously injects the Christian with the poison of radicalism. Reconciliation with the world as it is, which is given to the Christian by Christ, is then called betrayal and denial of Christ. In its place come bitterness, suspicion, and contempt for human beings in the world. Love that believes all things, bears all things, hopes for all things. Love that loves the world and its very wickedness with the love of God becomes, by limiting love to the closed circle of the pious, a pharisaical refusal of love for the wicked. Thus, a world that has become evil succeeds in making Christians evil also. Being on the receiving ends of threats and physical abuse on August 12th, I experienced the power of this warning. Shortly after, a group of neo-Nazis, I showed you a picture a little while ago, punched through a band of us, and I don't want to go into any great detail about that. Band of us occupying one set of stairs leading to the park, the League of the South, was headed in our direction when a group of Black Lives Matter local activists, as well as groups labeled Antifa, rushed up to protect us. It was like those scenes in The Lord of Rings when the two clashing armies clashed together. I mean, it was absolute chaos, people beating on one another, batons coming out, sticks being wielded, gas, tear gas, bottles of urine flying through the air, rocks. It was unlike anything that I've ever experienced. And in that moment, being in the middle of that, I wanted a club to fight back with, a way to respond, a way to do something rather than say, this little light of mine. Some burly guy sort of pushed me and yelled at me, move or I'm going to punch. I won't say the rest of what he said. Some primal dark place inside of me wanted to lash out and beat him back. And I discovered that my commitment to the nonviolence of Jesus can waver under the right conditions. I was guilty of exactly what Bonhoeffer spoke of, hating the wicked with every fiber of my being, of wanting them gone the same way they want Jews and people of color erased. I had no space for reconciliation in me. We too often respond to personal injury with a desire to avenge our dignity. And when this happens, we lose sight of the true evil in front of us, a type of malevolence that can turn us into the very thing we hate. The political implications of this awareness are not that we allow evil to grow, or white supremacy or anti-Semitism to go unchallenged. Indeed, I wish the church would speak with a stronger voice against these corrosions of human society and community. But I have to remember that there are many Christianities, not just mine. And this brings me back to the type of community we are weaving together that will sustain us in troubled times. Even if it seems like little in the face of such great powers, communities of faith do offer hope in their witness and courage to make known Christ. They help prevent us from becoming the monster ourselves. Does our faith community stand for the vulnerable bodies in our midst in the name of the one body? Those who want to discipline themselves into beloved communities will be tested as to the depths of violence that rest in each of us as they occupy their public spaces. And we must resist the siren call of violence. But church, we also need informing by spiritual disciplines to sustain our community life. And this is one of the reasons that I find Bonhoeffer's reflections in Letters and Papers from Prison on something he calls arcane disciplines so compelling. He talks about the necessity of the church to recover the arcane discipline, to structure and to spiritually discipline ourselves. These arcane disciplines, prayer, fasting, Eucharist, they form the spiritually disciplined grounds of strengthening resistance to the spirit of nihilism in our political orders. So despite his best efforts, Bonhoeffer was not able to create this kind of community, and tragically moved to other communities who, even for mixed reasons, were trying to stop the destruction of their nation. Standing amid the escalating swirl of chaos on August the 12th, I thought about the failure of the church in Bonhoeffer's day. And in that moment, I actually admired those on our line who professed no belief in Christianity, but they responded to visceral hatred by defending the vulnerable. So was that community a church? Perhaps. All I know is that they were present to stand with Christ in this particular moment of suffering, standing against the spirit of nihilism and nothingness that feeds on hate. These folks bore witness that humanity, indeed all of God's good creation, is threatened when we lose the vision that we are all in this together, and that the suffering God that Bonhoeffer writes so much about desires nothing more than that we be healed from our present brokenness. So I'm going to stop there, and we can open this up for discussion.
Jeffrey, my first question is your paper available anywhere?
A more, how do I want to say this? A different version of this paper is a chapter in a book on Bonhoeffer's political theology that was just released back in the fall.
Okay.
But it's insanely expensive because it's one of those academic books. So maybe if you want, I don't know if it's legal for me to photocopy it and send it out, but I'll do it.
My wife's a lawyer. It'll be fine.
And then we'll find out.
So the first question is from Joseph McKinney. He says, Professor Pugh, please comment on your statements that distinguish between the U.S. evangelical focus on individual salvation versus Bonhoeffer's focus on the Christian community living and acting in the world as it actually exists. And then he quotes you. The Bible is not so concerned with the individualistic doctrine of salvation, in no small part because concern with this draws our attention away from the world that God has given us to live within at the moment.
Well, Bonhoeffer himself writes this in Letters and Papers from Prison. He said he's not concerned at all about individual salvation. because he doesn't think that that's the heart of the Christian message. The heart of the Christian message is that the reality of God has embraced the world, is involved in reconciling the world to himself. Now, it's well if we ourselves come to an understanding and a knowledge that, in fact, this is what God is up to, the reconciliation of the world with God. I find, and I say this as a former evangelical, born-again Pentecostal, I find great power in the knowledge that this world is not left to its own devices, it's not left to its own defenses. But sometimes that notion of personal salvation becomes pretty kind of concerned about us, and it becomes a very egocentric thing. So we say, I accepted Christ last night. And in reality, the reality is that Christ accepted you. It's good that you came into that. It's good that you understood that, and your life will be immeasurably enhanced and enriched by it. But God's action in the world, God's presence in the world is more important than my own personal salvation. Now, and this makes people very nervous sometimes when you say these things, but I think we've all heard that old expression. When did you get saved? Well, I would say 2,000 years ago. Because the important thing was what takes place on the cross and the resurrection, and also the life ministry of Jesus. More than my or your or any person's acceptance of it, God was reconciling the world. Now, in as much as you were included in the world, great. But your salvation was not the most important thing at stake.
Boom.
I don't mean
in the Bible, so it's fine.
I don't mean that to sound, as in Adam all die, in Christ all shall be made alive. I sometimes think we lose the corporate sense of what Christianity is, because well, two things. A number of people, and I see them all the time on Twitter. A number of people think Christianity started when they accepted it. And they have absolutely no sense of any church history, none. They have no idea anything historically about the church. So the ideas and stuff that they present show no historical context, in which I keep thinking, if you just knew a little history, you wouldn't say things.
You're sounding a lot like David Bentley Hart right now. It's good.
No, well, yeah, but he would be saying it so much better. With so many intricate words.
Yeah, words that he makes up. Don't sell yourself short. It's good.
So another question from John Page. He wants to know, how would Bonhoeffer suggest we, assuming we are aligned with Christ and haven't gotten it wrong ourselves, how would we reach those closest? How would we reach those close to us, bring the truth to those close to us in faithful witness to Christ, those who are insulated by layers of propaganda and misinformation, without creating an enemy, maybe an enemy in my own family? I think this is a problem for a lot of people right now. So,
oh yeah, and yeah, don't ask me. All I can say is that in my personal struggle with this, I try to find the places of commonality, and then work out from there. Unfortunately, what has happened in too many circumstances now is that those places of commonality are getting harder and harder to reach. Now, the one thing I kept thinking about, and you guys who were at the Crackers and Juice thing at annual conference, remember I said we're not in a Bonhoeffer moment, we're in a Will Campbell moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember what year that was, but I had little idea that the Will Campbell moment was coming. But this is exactly the willingness to place yourself, and it's not a comfortable thing to do, to place yourself in the presence of others who are racist, is very difficult. and not place yourself there, compromise yourself, but to place yourself there as bearing witness. Sometimes people this quote that I have up on the screen now, I found it to be a very convicting quote, because I'm not sure I love the world that much. I'm not sure I love my enemies that much. But Bonhoeffer says that there is a love that is able to pierce through the wickedness that people find themselves in. And I keep thinking, well, that's exactly what we proclaim as the gospel. While I was yet a sinner, while we were yet sinners, God was reconciling the world to God's self. So, when we're sitting around, and maybe this Thanksgiving we won't be doing this, but when we're sitting around the table with those who find themselves captivated by political propaganda, the only thing I know what to do is just to keep a space open for them, because later on they may need one. They may need a safe space to go to and say, I don't know what happened.
I mean, I remember like when we had that conversation.
Other people have better. Yeah.
I mean, when we had that conversation with you right after Charlottesville, I mean, the one thing I remember you saying clearly was like in the melee, like you wanted to hit someone. Oh,
I did. I really did. Because I'd been knocked out and not knocked out, but one of those guys with shields bumped up against us as they were coming out of the stairs. And look, I'm terrified the whole morning. I spent terrified, except for at one point, this unbelievable peace sank in. It was the weirdest thing. But I remember very much just wishing I wish I could strike back. And even in that moment, the discipline, the spiritual discipline of this is not the space that God desires me to be in, stops me short.
Jeffrey, I want to say thank you for vocalizing that and that feeling you had. And I think it's a freeing thing for many of us, because a lot of times we see online, on Twitter, on places like that, Christian pacifism promoted as something that's should be natural for all Christians. And if you can't figure out how to do it, there's something obviously wrong with you and your faith. But I think what you're vocalizing is something that a lot of people on this call tonight have probably felt at some point throughout their lives, or something that they will feel later in their lives.
Well, look, okay, let me go ahead and say, can you hear me? Let me just go ahead and say, I can't be a solitary pacifist. I'm only a pacifist in a community. And I'm only a pacifist in a community that's able to strengthen me in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Left to my own devices, I'm a killer. There's a killer in you, there's a killer in me. What, Smashing Pumpkins? I need the community. And this is one of the things that Hauerwas, sort of really helps us understand, is how important the community is to forming the spiritual disciplines in which we live. It's not the sort of spiritual hero, but it's the willingness of the community to stand with one another in really difficult moments. I need the church.
And I mean, one of the things Stanley's really good at too is stressing how it's important for Christians to vocalize their convictions so that the community will then hold them accountable to those convictions.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, like Jeffrey just holding to himself his belief in Christian nonviolence is not a good strategy for Jeffrey being a nonviolent person.
Yes.
So we have a few more minutes left. Does anyone else have any other questions before Tier wraps us up with Jeffrey here tonight?
Hi, Jeffrey and Jason. I'm Glenn from Columbus, Ohio. I might be the token Lutheran in the bunch. I don't know. A lot of UMC talk going around, I think.
Yeah.
But right at the end, Jeffrey, when you mentioned the arcane disciplines, brought to mind one of Bonhoeffer's books that we haven't really, I don't remember mentioning, that's Life Together,
Yes.
which I think helped shape him and shape the seminary at Finkenwald. And that seems to develop those themes that you mentioned of prayer, community, Eucharist, and so forth, and listening for the word.
Yes. And he revisits this in Letters and Papers from Prison when he's thinking about, his outline for a book and what he's going to write after he gets out about what Christianity is. And those arcane disciplines that he develops, he had an abiding interest in monastic communities. When he was in the pastorate in London, he would go visit the Anglo-Catholic communities that were sort of scattered out the UK, just to sort of understand how they ordered their lives. And he wanted to really bring that kind of disciplines into Finkenwalde. And he does gather that sort of smaller circle, Betke and others. He gathers that smaller circle around him, and that's sort of that out of which Life Together sort of blossoms and stuff. But like Luther, I think Bonhoeffer comes to the point where he realizes that the ecclesiola and ecclesia, the small church within the large church, wasn't necessarily enough to sustain the arcane disciplines on its own. It could strengthen and enable spiritual disciplines, spiritual practice, but I think he realized that well, you're Lutheran. Was it Glenn? Luther has this great simul justus et peccator. We are simultaneously justified and sinner. And I remember in my Luther class, the first time I encountered that, and I thought to myself, well, I like that better than Wesley. Because that seems, Wesley's got, I don't want to be sanctified. But that notion that we are constantly in that tension of the justified sinner struck me as being profound. And I think Bonhoeffer also understood that very well in his own life. But yeah, you're right. And one of the things in the larger book that I wrote called Religionless Christianity, in which I'm talking about some of Bonhoeffer's more confusing themes at the end in the Letters and Papers from Prison, I have a chapter about the arcane disciplines being the point where the community can become a disciplined community. And I point out Eucharist, and I point to a couple of very specific spaces. One of which was, I don't know if you ever watched the movie Romero or not, about Archbishop Oscar Romero, but there's a very compelling scene, two of them actually, in this movie, where the celebration of Eucharist becomes the most powerful opposition to the militarism of the state. In the movie, when he takes back the church at Aguilara, and he comes back into the church, and the crowd's behind him, and they're coming up, and the soldiers that are occupying the church have their weapons drawn, and they're going in to celebrate Eucharist. And I keep thinking to myself, for so many Christians, maybe not Lutherans, because I attended a Lutheran congregation for 3 years when I was a graduate student at New Jersey. But for Methodist, a recovery of the power of the Eucharist as a place of profound spiritual formation, and maybe this isn't the way with the crackers and juice pastors, but I know it's this way with the majority of Methodist and Virginia Conference. Eucharist is not that space where we understand this moment of resistance to the way that the world tries to construct us. So that if I am at the table, I am understanding that I'm preaching now, I'm sorry, that there are other people at other tables around the world. And how can I participate in systems that will cause them harm? And I understand this when I take the Eucharist, that I am connected to Christians globally, that becomes a profound space of spiritual discipline, because it's an arcane discipline that calls us to another reality than the ones that we are constantly being fed and asked to embrace and internalize.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I got all preachy there, Glenn.
You're good.
I'm glad a Lutheran's here.
To the very end.
So, and look, to a very end, Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran theologian.
How about the rest of you all? Feel free to just pop in real quick.
Professor Pugh, this is Joe McKinney,
Hey, Joe.
another one of the Lutherans.
Hey.
But
Hey.
you've got another comment here.
They're the only ones at home drinking right now. That's why they're so gregarious.
Yeah, well, that Anglicans have it all over us when it comes to drinking.
Well, Luther does say that Philip Amsdorf and I drank good Wittenberg beer while the Word of God did its work. So,
but here you make a comment that buried deep in the heart of our national mythologies is one that tells us God has especially blessed us, Americans, to rid the world of evil, right the wrongs of evildoers, and so forth. How do we preserve the value of these, Christian goals, but get it out from underneath the special mission of the U.S. as opposed to other political entities around the world?
can you rephrase that? I'm not sure I get the importance.
Well, some of these things, some of the these matters are really, really important. Rid the world of evil, right the wrongs of the evildoers, make the world safe for democracy and freedom. Those are not necessarily bad goals, but they are when they become exclusive to our society as opposed to others.
Yeah,
and how do we go ahead?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, the problem with evildoers that I've always had is that it makes an assumption about who the evildoers are, and that I'm not one of them. And the minute that I'm willing to consider that I myself, simul justus et peccator, that I myself am potential of that, then even in the service of the good, I can perform great evil. As a matter of fact, Bonhoeffer writes in Ethics, I think it's in the first section of the Ethics, and I can't remember what the name of it, The Reality of the Good. Bonhoeffer says that some of the most grievous harm in the world is done by those who are thinking that they are doing good. Because our capacity for self-deception is so strong.
True.
That often I will lay waste to you and claim that I'm doing it for the good when I'm actually doing it for my own purposes, whose purposes are not necessarily known to me. So I'm going to give you an aphorism from Nietzsche here, and I'm paraphrasing, but he writes, I want to get this right. Memory says, I did that. Pride says, I could not have done that, and remains inexorable. Eventually, memory yields. So I think that when we think about how we fight evil, we don't, it's right here up on the screen, that there is a sense in which you have to fight evil with a love for the other human being that you are resisting. Now how we deal with that, now how Bonhoeffer deals with that, I one of the things that, the reason that I can't shake him entirely is because when he moves into that resistance to assassinate Hitler, he realizes he is entering into an evil deed. He is taking upon himself an evil act. He says this plainly. And he says that as Christ accepts the evil of the world, the sin of the world, so he does too. He can't allow his hands to stay clean, so to speak, and he gets his hands dirty, and that was probably one of the most heartbreaking, heart-wrenching failures of the Christian church, is that other Christians have to assume that level of evil to protect the innocent. And so, Joe, when we start to think about sort of going against evil is a good thing, all too often we become absorbed by it in our opposition to it, and we don't even recognize that that's happened.
That might touch on Terry Reuter's question, who always asks good questions. And so basically she wants to know is how do we respond to hatred and bigotry as Christians without making ourselves out to be the true Christians?
Once again, we have to do that in the community. We have to think about what are the spaces in which that hatred and bigotry grows. I don't think that I'm capable of being friends with a white supremacist, but I'm capable of being in some relationship to them that tries to keep the door open for them to see themselves as they really are. And I think an absolute and total rejection, I mean, when you just read Twitter, you read stuff, the political order, the social order is well, we're just going to cut this person off from any conversation whatsoever. Well, you might have to tell the truth. You might have to tell the truth about what that person's involved in, but there's always a door open. Isn't this a gospel that the door is always open to us, no matter how fallen we are? The door is always open to us for reconciliation, and everybody figures out how to calibrate keeping that space or that door open. Doesn't mean you make yourself vulnerable. It doesn't mean you make yourself a victim to the oppressor. I'm not advocating that you let the people walk all over you, or you let the oppressor oppress you, because you tell the oppressor the truth, but you also recognize that God may well be at work somewhere in that situation. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but the fact of the matter is there is no satisfactory answer. It's a continually ongoing struggle with all of us to embody the gospel for other human beings, and we fail and we succeed at various ways.
Christ is the opened door, I think, is how Francis Spufford puts it in Unapologetic.
But I succeed better in the community than I do by myself. Left to my own devices, I have a whole list of people I'd hate.
Jeffrey, I think that's a great place for us to end. I want you all to give Jeffrey a Zoom round of applause, if you will. Okay, I see Glenn doing that, so that's good. That's good. And Tier, will you close us out tonight?
Yeah, thanks to everybody for checking out our second online Zoom course series, whatever you want to call it. Thank you to Jeffrey for joining us and participating. In 2021, which promises to be a better year than 2020, we've got 2 online series that have been confirmed, and we're ironing out the last minute details. We're going to do an apocalyptic reading of the book of Romans. And the theme is going to be resurrecting justice. That'll be with Douglas Harnick. And then we're going to also be looking at Calvin's political theology of exile with Ruben Rosario.
Wow.
Those will be winter and spring 2021. You'll be the first to get information about it. And if you're not, or if you don't see it in your email, it'll be all over our website and social media, so you won't want to miss that. And I thought to close this with a prayer tonight, because Jeffrey mentioned Stanley Hauerwas, I would read a prayer from his book, Prayers Plainly Spoken, and this prayer is titled, I do not want my enemies forgiven. So let us pray. Forgiving Lord, I do not want my enemies forgiven. I want you to kill them, as sometimes prays the psalmist. Actually, I would prefer to pray that you punish them rather than kill them, since I would like to watch them suffer. Also, I fear losing my enemies, since my hates are more precious to me than my loves. If I lost my hates, my enemies, how would I know who I am? Yet you have bent us toward reconciliation, that we may be able to pass one another Christ's peace. It is a terrible thing to ask of us. I'm sure I cannot do it, but you are a wily God, able to accomplish miracles. May we be struck alive with the miracle of your grace, even to being reconciled with ourselves. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tier. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeffrey.